September 17th, 1944. Early morning. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Granville, France. Rain streaked the windows as staff officers clustered around a massive wall map of Northwest Europe. The pins and arrows told a story of momentum. Paris liberated, German forces retreating, Allied armies surging east. For weeks, the advance had felt unstoppable. But this morning, the room was tense. Not because of what the Germans were doing, but because of what the Allies were about to attempt. At precisely 10 a.m., General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, approved the largest airborne operation in history. 3.5 divisions, over 1,700 aircraft, hundreds of gliders, a single narrow road stretching from the Dutch border to Arnhem, and at the far end of that road, a bridge that would decide whether the war in Europe might end before Christmas or drag on for another brutal year. Operation Market Garden was now irreversible. The plan rested on speed, surprise, and confidence. Confidence in Allied air supremacy, confidence in German disorganization, and above all, confidence in one man, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British 21st Army Group. Montgomery had argued relentlessly for this plan. One bold thrust north, one decisive blow. Bypass the Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine, split Germany in half. Eisenhower listened. He weighed the risks. He heard the objections. And then he chose to trust Montgomery. But as the engines warmed on airfields across England, troubling intelligence lay scattered across desks. Reports of German armored formations refitting near Arnhem, intercepted radio traffic hinting at resistance stronger than expected. Warnings from Dutch sources that the enemy was not as broken as Allied planners believed. Some officers saw the danger. Others dismissed it. Eisenhower stood at the center of it all, balancing coalition politics, fragile alliances, and competing egos. He was not choosing just a plan. He was choosing which commander to back, which strategy to prioritize, and which warnings to set aside. The airborne drops began just hours later. Paratroopers would soon be fighting house to house in Dutch towns. Tanks would grind forward along a single exposed highway. Radios would fail. Timetables would slip. And at Arnhem, men would hold a bridge they were never meant to hold alone. But to understand why Eisenhower trusted Montgomery so completely, why he accepted the risk, and why he ignored a warning that could have changed everything, we need to go back. Back to the months of rivalry, pressure, and political calculation that shaped one of the most controversial decisions of the war. Because Market Garden was not born in September 1944. It was the product of trust forged long before, and a warning Eisenhower chose not to hear. To understand why Dwight D. Eisenhower placed such extraordinary trust in Bernard Montgomery in September 1944, it is necessary to rewind nearly 2 years, back to a relationship forged under pressure, necessity, and political compromise. When Eisenhower arrived in Britain in June 1942 as commanding general of the U.S. European Theater of Operations, he was an untested field commander. He had never led troops in combat. What he possessed instead was an uncommon ability to manage people, particularly difficult, ambitious, and politically sensitive allies. That skill would define his war. Montgomery, by contrast, was already a legend in the making. After taking command of the British Eighth Army in August 1942, he halted a demoralized retreat in North Africa and delivered a decisive victory over Field Marshal Erwin Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. It was a battle Montgomery would reference for the rest of his life. Proof, in his mind, that meticulous preparation, overwhelming force, and centralized control were the only reliable paths to victory. Their first major collaboration came during Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942. Eisenhower, as overall commander, was forced to balance British experience with American inexperience, while navigating French political chaos and limited resources. Montgomery, commanding British ground forces in the East, pushed relentlessly for operational clarity and frequently questioned Eisenhower's decisions. The tension was immediate. Montgomery saw Eisenhower as cautious, even indecisive. Eisenhower saw Montgomery as brilliant, but inflexible. Yet despite the friction, the campaign succeeded. Tunisia fell in May 1943. Axis forces in Africa surrendered. Over 230,000 prisoners taken. It was a strategic triumph that validated coalition warfare, but only barely. That pattern repeated itself in Sicily in July 1943. Operation Husky was intended as a coordinated advance, with Montgomery's 8th Army and General George S. Patton's U.S. 7th Army moving in a parallel. Instead, Montgomery altered plans mid-campaign, funneling resources toward his own axis of advance and forcing Patton into a supporting role. Eisenhower intervened repeatedly to keep the coalition from fracturing. Privately, Eisenhower recorded his frustration. In a letter to General George C. Marshall, he described Montgomery as difficult, but indispensable. The phrase mattered. Eisenhower did not need Montgomery to be likable. He needed him to deliver results. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, Montgomery had become impossible to ignore. As commander of all Allied ground forces during the initial phase of Operation Overlord, he presented the invasion plan to political leaders with absolute certainty. His briefings were confident, simplified, and persuasive. He promised rapid progress, the destruction of German forces in Normandy, and a swift breakout into France. The reality was more complex. The Normandy campaign bogged down into a brutal war of attrition. Canadian forces became fixed around Caen, suffering heavy casualties. American forces eventually achieved the breakout at Saint-Lô with Operation Cobra in late July. Yet Montgomery reframed the narrative, arguing that his role had always been to hold German armor in place while the Americans struck decisively. Eisenhower accepted the explanation, not because it was universally agreed upon, but because it preserved unity. That decision revealed a critical aspect of Eisenhower's leadership. He prioritized coalition cohesion over individual ego. Montgomery commanded Britain's largest field army. He was Winston Churchill's most prominent general. Publicly undermining him would have risked political fallout in London at a moment when Allied unity was essential. As Allied armies surged across France in August 1944, a new problem emerged: success itself. The rapid advance stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Ports were damaged or unusable. Fuel shortages became acute. Eisenhower faced a strategic dilemma: how to sustain momentum without collapsing logistically. Two competing visions emerged. Eisenhower favored a broad front strategy, steady advances across the entire line, keeping pressure on German forces everywhere. Montgomery proposed something different: a single, concentrated thrust north through the Netherlands, crossing the Rhine and driving straight into Germany's industrial heartland. Montgomery argued that the Germans were finished. Their reserves were exhausted. Their command structure was collapsing. One final blow, he insisted, could end the war in 1944. 44. He had made similar claims before. This time, Eisenhower listened more closely than ever, because Montgomery was not just offering a plan. He was offering certainty at a moment when uncertainty threatened to stall the Allied advance entirely. And yet, beneath the optimism, warning signs were already visible. German forces were reorganizing faster than Allied intelligence estimated. The Theustes Panzer Corps, 2 elite armored divisions, was refitting near Arnhem. Ultra-intercepts hinted at increased German coordination. Dutch resistance reports described armor movements that contradicted Allied assumptions. These details circulated. They were not hidden. The question was not whether Eisenhower had access to warnings. The question was why, when the moment came, he chose to trust Montgomery's judgment over the intelligence in front of him. And to understand that decision, we must look at the days immediately before Market Garden, at the meetings, compromises, and quiet calculations that transformed a bold proposal into an approved opera. By early September 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a deceptive phase. To the public, and even to many officers, the German army appeared to be in full collapse. Paris had been liberated on August 25th. Brussels fell unopposed on September 3rd. Antwerp, with its vast port facilities intact, was captured the very next day. But beneath the surface, the situation was far more fragile. The Allied advance had outrun its logistics. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to the beaches of Normandy. Fuel shortages forced armored units to halt. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Eisenhower's headquarters received daily reports warning that the pace of operations was unsustainable without a major logistical reset. This was the opening Montgomery had been waiting for. 1. Montgomery's argument. One last blow. On September 4, 1944, Montgomery submitted a detailed proposal to Eisenhower. It was not entirely new. He had been advocating a single decisive thrust for weeks, but now he framed it as the only viable solution to the supply crisis. Montgomery's logic was simple and forceful. Concentrate available supplies on one axis. Use airborne forces to seize bridges deep behind enemy lines. Drive an armored corps rapidly north along a single highway. Cross the Rhine at Arnhem. Break into Germany's Ruhr industrial region. If successful, the plan would bypass the Siegfried Line entirely. Montgomery argued that Germany's remaining strength was an illusion. He insisted that enemy forces in the Netherlands consisted largely of shattered infantry units incapable of coordinated resistance. Armor, he claimed, was either destroyed or retreating east. In a message to Eisenhower, Montgomery declared that the enemy was finished. All that remained was the courage to strike decisively. Eisenhower was skeptical, but intrigued. 2. Eisenhower's calculus. Strategy versus coalition politics. Eisenhower faced pressure from every direction. General Omar Bradley advocated continued American advances toward the Saar and Frankfurt. General George S. Patton demanded fuel for a deep thrust into Germany via Lorraine. British political leadership, including Prime Minister Winston Churchill, openly favored Montgomery's plan, seeing it as a chance for a dramatic British-led victory. Eisenhower's authority rested on his ability to balance these competing demands. Approving Montgomery's plan would do several things at once. It would concentrate scarce supplies on a single operation. It would give the British Army a leading role after weeks of American breakthroughs. It would demonstrate Allied decisiveness at a moment when momentum appeared to be slowing. Rejecting it, however, risked alienating London and Montgomery personally. Eisenhower chose compromise. On September 10th, he approved a modified version of Montgomery's proposal. The operation would be limited in scope, reliant on airborne forces to secure the route. and executed rapidly to minimize logistical strain. The operation received its final name, Operation Market Garden. Market referred to the airborne landings. Garden referred to the ground advance by British 6XX Corps. The timetable was brutally tight. 3. Intelligence warnings. Seen, not acted upon. As planning accelerated, intelligence reports grew increasingly contradictory. Ultra-decrypts, Allied signals intelligence derived from intercepted German communications, indicated that the SS Panzer Corps, including the 9th and 10th SSS Panzer Divisions, was refitting near Arnhem after heavy losses in Normandy. Dutch resistance networks independently reported German armor moving through the region. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed vehicles concealed beneath trees near landing zones. These reports reached multiple desks. They reached Eisenhower's staff. They reached Montgomery's headquarters. They reached the planners of the British 1st Airborne Division. Some officers raised alarms. Major Brian Urquhart, a senior intelligence officer on Montgomery's staff, warned that the presence of SS Panzer divisions posed a severe threat to lightly armed airborne troops. He argued that Arnhem was too far, the drop zones too distant from the bridge, and the timetable too optimistic. The response was swift and telling. Urquhart was removed from planning duties, officially for nervous exhaustion. Montgomery dismissed the intelligence as exaggerated. He believed the German armor was non-operational. Eisenhower, informed of the concerns, deferred to Montgomery's assessment. It was a critical moment. Eisenhower did not ignore intelligence because he was unaware of it. He set it aside because trusting Montgomery had become a habit, one reinforced by 2 years of coalition warfare. 4. The plan solidifies. The final plan depended on 4 assumptions. German forces in the Netherlands were disorganized and weak. Airborne troops could hold bridges for 48 hours. XXX Corps could advance 64 miles along a single elevated road without major interruption. The weather would hold. If any one of these failed, the entire operation was at risk. Nevertheless, preparation moved forward at extraordinary speed. Airborne units trained intensively. Glider pilots rehearsed landings. Engineers prepared bridging equipment. Montgomery projected absolute confidence in briefings, assuring commanders that resistance would be minimal. On September 16th, the night before the landings, Eisenhower sent a message to his commanders, expressing optimism, but also restraint. He described Market Garden as a bold maneuver, not a guaranteed victory. Privately, however, the die was cast. The operation began the next morning, and once the first paratrooper stepped out into the Dutch sky, there would be no opportunity to correct the assumptions that underpinned the plan. Now, back to September 17th, no 44. Because the rising action was about to collide with reality, at Arnhem, on a narrow road, and in the judgment of men who had believed speed could substitute for certainty. September 17th, 1944. p.m. The skies over the Netherlands filled with aircraft. From the ground, it appeared almost unreal. Thousands of parachutes blossomed against a clear blue sky. Gliders swept in low, skimming fields and hedgerows. For Dutch civilians watching from below, it looked like liberation descending from the heavens. For Allied planners, it was the moment of truth. The airborne phase, Market, began largely as planned. The U.S. 101st Airborne landed north of Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne dropped near Nijmegen. And farther north, near the town of Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division descended on drop zones several miles from their objective, the Arnhem Road Bridge over the lower Rhine. That distance would soon prove fatal. Arnhem, The assumption collapses. Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, commander of the British White Airborne Corps, had accepted the wide drop zones reluctantly. Aircraft limitations and concerns about anti-aircraft fire dictated the decision. But the consequence was immediate. Precious hours lost marching toward the bridge. Only one battalion, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion, reached Arnhem Bridge on the first day. They arrived to find it intact. For a brief moment, Montgomery's vision seemed within reach, but the Germans were not disorganized. They were reacting. Fast. The WWII Panzer Corps was very real. General Wilhelm Bittrich, its commander, grasped the significance of the bridge within hours. Elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division, despite being under strength, moved quickly to contain the British perimeter. German commanders exploited every advantage: interior lines, local knowledge, and heavy weapons unavailable to airborne troops. British radios failed almost immediately. Units became isolated. Coordination collapsed. By nightfall on September 17th, Frost's men held the northern end of the bridge. But they were alone. The single road south of Arnhem, the ground phase, Garden, began its advance. British WWII Corps, led by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, moved north from the Belgian border along a narrow elevated highway, later known as Hell's Highway. The road was flanked by marshland, canals, and soft ground unsuitable for tanks. Any delay would be magnified. Any blockage could halt the entire operation. The Germans understood this faster than Allied planners had anticipated. Small, mobile German units, often ad hoc formations, launched repeated counterattacks against the road. Bridges destroyed, vehicles knocked out, traffic jams formed. Progress slowed to a crawl. The timetable began to slip almost immediately. X-Corps was supposed to reach Arnhem in 2 days. By the end of the first day, they were not even halfway to Nijmegen. Eisenhower watches. From his headquarters, Eisenhower received reports that were increasingly troubling. Airborne units were encountering heavier resistance than expected. Radio silence from Arnhem was nearly complete. German counterattacks were intensifying. The single-road advance was proving far more vulnerable than anticipated. Yet Eisenhower did not intervene. At this stage, intervention would have meant overriding Montgomery's operational control, something Eisenhower was deeply reluctant to do once an operation was underway. Coalition command demanded trust. Reversal risked chaos. Montgomery, for his part, remained publicly confident. In communications to London and SHAEF, he emphasized progress. Delays were described as temporary. Resistance was characterized as fragmented. But reality on the ground was diverging rapidly from the plan. Nijmegen. A costly delay. At Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne encountered unexpectedly stiff resistance at the Vaal River Bridge. German defenders held the far bank with machine guns and artillery. The bridge had to be taken. On September 20th, American paratroopers conducted a desperate daylight river crossing in canvas boats under direct fire. Casualties were severe, but the assault succeeded. The bridge fell. It was a heroic action. It was also 2 days late. By the time XXX Corps crossed the Vaal, the delay had sealed the fate of Arnhem. Arnhem falls. At Arnhem Bridge, Frost's battalion held out for 4 days. They fought street by street, house by house, against armor, artillery, and infantry. Anti-tank weapons were scarce. Ammunition dwindled. Wounded piled up inside shattered buildings. On September 21st, German tanks rolled directly onto the bridge. The perimeter collapsed. The remainder of the British 1st Airborne, trapped west of Arnhem at Oosterbeek, formed a shrinking defensive pocket. Supplies dropped by air fell largely into German hands. Relief never came. On the night of September 25th, the survivors were evacuated across the Rhine under fire. Out of more than 10,000 men dropped near Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 escaped. Market Garden had failed. The moment of reckoning. The failure was not sudden. It unfolded step by step, assumption by assumption. The Germans were not finished. The armor was not irrelevant. The road was not secure. The timetable was not realistic. And at the center of it all was a decision made days earlier, when Eisenhower had trusted Montgomery's certainty over intelligence that urged caution. The turning point was not Arnhem itself. It was the moment the warnings were acknowledged and dismissed. The silence that followed Operation Market Garden was as telling as the battle itself. By September 26, 1944, Allied headquarters could no longer obscure the truth. The operation had failed to achieve its primary objective. The Rhine had not been crossed. The Ruhr remained out of reach. The war would not end in 1944. Casualty reports arrived in steady, unforgiving numbers. Approximately 17,000 Allied casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting formation. German losses were significant, but replaceable. Strategically, the balance had not shifted. Eisenhower absorbed the news quietly. There was no public rebuke, no dramatic reshuffling of command, no immediate reckoning. Instead, the Supreme Commander did what he had done throughout the war. He contained the damage, preserved unity, and moved forward. But privately, the consequences of Market Garden reshaped Allied strategy. Eisenhower's response: containment, not confrontation. In the days following the evacuation from Arnhem, Eisenhower resisted calls to assign blame. His correspondence emphasized shared responsibility. Market Garden, he argued, had been a calculated risk, one that had not paid off. This language was deliberate. Directly confronting Montgomery would have risked a public rupture between British and American leadership. Winston Churchill continued to defend the operation as 90% successful, a claim Eisenhower did not publicly contradict. The fiction was allowed to stand. Behind closed doors, however, Eisenhower adjusted. Montgomery's authority narrowed. His influence over broad strategic direction diminished. Eisenhower increasingly asserted direct control over ground operations, reinforcing the broad front approach he had previously set aside. Trust, once unquestioned, became conditional. Montgomery's interpretation. Montgomery never accepted that Market Garden had failed because of flawed assumptions. In his post-war writings and wartime communications, he reframed the operation as sound in concept, but undermined by execution, specifically by delays in the ground advance. He did not concede that intelligence had been mishandled. He did not acknowledge that Arnhem had been a bridge too far. This mattered. Montgomery's refusal to fully reassess the operation confirmed what many senior Allied commanders already believed, that his confidence, while invaluable in some contexts, bordered on strategic inflexibility. Eisenhower took note. The strategic cost. The failure of Market Garden had immediate and long-term consequences. The Rhine remained intact. The Allies would not cross the Rhine until March 1945, 6 months later, at Remagen and during Operation Plunder. Germany gained precious time to regroup. Antwerp remained closed. Although captured early, the port of Antwerp could not be used until the Scheldt estuary was cleared, a task delayed in part because resources had been diverted to Market Garden. This logistical bottleneck plagued Allied operations into the winter. German recovery accelerated. The pause allowed German forces to stabilize the front, reconstitute units, and prepare for a counteroffensive, one that would erupt in December as the Battle of the Bulge. Airborne doctrine. Re-evaluated large-scale airborne operations against prepared opposition fell out of favor. The assumptions underpinning Market Garden were no longer acceptable. Intelligence and leadership, the uncomfortable lesson, perhaps the most enduring lesson of Market Garden, was not tactical. It was organizational. The intelligence had been there. Ultra-decrypts, aerial, reconnaissance, resistance reports, staff warnings. They were not ignored because they were unknown. They were sidelined because they conflicted with a trusted commander's judgment. Eisenhower's leadership style, so effective in maintaining coalition unity, contained an inherent risk. Trust, once earned, could override caution. Deference, once habitual, could suppress dissent. Market Garden exposed that vulnerability. Eisenhower did not lose the war because of it, but he learned from it. In subsequent operations, particularly during the Ardennes crisis, Eisenhower would rely more heavily on dissenting views, encourage debate, and assert centralized control when consensus failed. The warning he had once set aside was not forgotten. It was absorbed. Too late for Arnhem, but not too late for the war. Operation Market Garden stands today as one of the most revealing moments of Allied leadership in the Second World War, not because it failed, but because of how and why it failed. Dwight D. Eisenhower did not miscalculate out of ignorance. He miscalculated out of trust. For 2 years, Bernard Montgomery had delivered results under difficult circumstances. He had stabilized collapsing fronts, imposed order on chaos, and spoken with a certainty that reassured political leaders and Allied commanders alike. In a coalition war defined by fragile unity, that certainty carried immense weight. When the moment came in September 1944, Eisenhower chose cohesion over confrontation. He chose momentum over hesitation. He chose Montgomery's confidence over intelligence that suggested caution. It was a calculated decision, one rooted in Eisenhower's greatest strength as a commander, and that was precisely the danger. Market Garden revealed the limits of leadership built on personal trust alone. It showed how even the most capable commanders can become insulated from contradiction. How warnings, when inconvenient, can be reframed as pessimism. How speed, once mistaken for strategy, can substitute for certainty, until it cannot. The men who paid the price were not the planners in France or London. They were the paratroopers at Arnhem, holding a bridge they were never meant to hold alone. They were the wounded left behind when evacuation became impossible. They were the survivors who returned, knowing the assumptions had failed them. Eisenhower never publicly denounced Montgomery for Market Garden. He did not need to. The adjustment came quietly, in tighter control, broader consensus, and a renewed respect for dissent. The war continued. The Rhine was crossed. Germany fell. But Arnhem remained. A reminder that leadership is not only about choosing bold plans, but about knowing when trust must yield to warning. For the WWII legacy, this is the story beneath the operation. Not just why Market Garden failed, but why Eisenhower trusted Montgomery, and what that choice reveals about power, alliance, and the cost of ignored intelligence. Because in war, the most dangerous moment is often not the decision. Decision to act